Last month, and even at the start of this month, as we headed into a new decade, I did a number of videos reflecting on the 10 years in football that made up the 2010s. In doing so, I have somewhat neglected all prior decades a little in recent times, which is unlike me, because as many of you will know, I'm usually so good at boring you all to death talking about footballers who played in black and white. Following our videos in which I shared my views on the 2010s team of the decade and tried to predict how a 2020s team of the decade might look, a number of people asked me to go further back and do a 1950s team of the decade, a 1960s one, 70s one, and so on and so forth. But unfortunately, as these two Sevens-based videos show, sadly no one watches videos like that. Instead, today we're going to go on a journey through the years going all the way back to the 1870s and right the way up to the present day, picking out who has been the best club side of each decade based on their players, performances, trophies, and consistency across each 10-year period. Here are my views on the best football team of every decade from the 1870s to the present day. 1870s. Wanderers. The only team in this video that no longer exists. Those of you who are unfamiliar with 19th century football may be wondering who on earth Wanderers are. The club was founded in 1859 as Forest Football Club by former pupils of the public schools Harrow and Forest School. Public schools are what we call fee-paying schools in the UK, just to avoid any confusion. English football pioneer Charles W. Alcock was among the team's founders, and Forest Football Club became Wanderers in 1864. The amateur outfit played only friendlies until the advent of the FA Cup, which they would dominate during the 1870s. Wanderers won the first FA Cup final in 1872, they defended their title in 1873, and they added 3 more FA Cup trophies in 1876, 1877 and 1878. For a team which provided 15 England internationals at one time, the Wanderers' decline after the 1870s was pretty rapid, as each public school set up their own teams with former pupils. But 142 years on from their most recent trophy, they remain the joint 10th most successful team in FA Cup history, and there can be few doubts about them taking the crown for the 1870s. 1880s. Queen's Park. It doesn't seem like that long ago that I did a video looking at the best national teams of every decade, and it is the case here, just as it was there, that English and Scottish sides are the only serious candidates in football's formative years. Both Blackburn Rovers and Preston North End deserve very honourable mentions for the 1880s, but Queen's Park were both the best and undoubtedly the most influential team of the decade. Throughout the 1870s, 80s and 90s, Queen's Park pioneered the modern passing style of football, which had been very individualistic up to that point. This novel approach made them the best team in Scotland, as they won the Scottish Cup in 1874, 1875, 1876, 1880, 1881, 1882, 1884, 1886, and in 1890. Queen's Park also twice made the final of the English FA Cup in the 1880s, losing to Blackburn on both occasions, and the team's dominance waned as Celtic and Rangers established their dominance in the 20th century. Nowadays, Queen's Park compete in the Scottish League too. 1890s. Aston Villa. It's a tight call between Aston Villa and Sunderland in the 1890s, with those two teams winning 9 out of the 10 First Division titles between 1892 and 1900. Villa won 5 of those titles in comparison to Sunderland's 4, although the last of those 5 in 1900 obviously didn't technically come during the 1890s. Villa also reached 3 FA Cup finals in the 1890s, winning 2 of them, and becoming only the second English club to win the double in 1897. Oddly, 2 of the best players in the country at one time were both Scottish forwards called John Campbell, one of whom played for Villa and the other for Sunderland, which would be a bit like having 2 Harry Kanes vying for the Golden Boot each season now. 1900s. Celtic. It's difficult to split the top English clubs and the top Scottish clubs during this era of football, with only a handful of friendly games there to give us any real indication. Liverpool and Newcastle were the best teams in England during the first decade of the 1900s, but Celtic really asserted their dominance north of the border in the second half of the decade. Under the guidance of secretary-manager Willie Maley, Celtic won the league on 6 occasions between 1905 and 1910, as well as winning the Scottish Cup 4 times, a record which included a double-double, the first of which was the first double in Scottish football. Explosive frontman Jimmy Quinn was Celtic's star man at the time, and Celtic played 21 games against English opposition between 1900 and 1910. Only one of those games was a competitive fixture, in which they beat Sunderland 5-1 in the British League Cup semi-final before defeating Rangers in the final. 1910s. Aston Villa. As we head into the 1910s, the rest of the world is just starting to take a real interest in football, although they can't yet compete with the might of the English and the Scots. If Aston Villa fans want a claim to fame, let it be known that they are the only team on earth who I consider to have been the best team in world football for more than one decade. The 1910s was a decade majorly disrupted by the First World War, so we're essentially looking at a period of just 5 years here. Villa weren't as dominant as they had been in the 1890s in the early 1910s, but only Blackburn Rovers, who deserve another honourable mention, could hold a candle to them in terms of consistency. Inspired by the brilliance of their starman Harry Hampton, who was the First Division top scorer every season between 1910 and 1915, Villa won one First Division title, one FA Cup, and twice finished as First Division runners-up. 1910s. Nacional. As with the video that I did a bit like this one for national teams, it's impossible to know how the South American teams of Uruguay, Brazil and Argentina would have fared against top-class British opposition in the 1910s. Certainly, Uruguay's national team could handle the best Europe could throw at it outside of Britain, and the outstanding club side at that time was Nacional. Their players dominated the national team, with the likes of Hector Castro, Pedro Patron, Hector Scarone, and particularly Jose Andrade, who was considered the best player in the world in the 1910s, all playing their club football for Nacional. The club were crowned champions of Uruguay 4 times in the 1920s, and my gut feeling is that they could mix it with Britain's best. If I were wrong, and we shall never know, then Huddersfield Town would be the worthy winners for the 1920s. 1930s. Juventus. Herbert Chapman went from Huddersfield Town to Arsenal in 1925, and Arsenal subsequently became the dominant force in the English game in the 1930s. They deserve a very honourable mention, but I think Juventus just edged this one. The club from Turin won just their third Scudetto in the 1930-31 season, but they would go on to dominate the decade with 5 consecutive league titles. Juve became the first professional club in Italy in the 1930s, and whilst Felice Borrell was their star man in terms of scoring goals, they had a plethora of stars. Their ageing squad, which was one of the inspirations for the nickname Old Lady that we associate with the club to this day, also formed the backbone of Vittorio Pozzo's 1934 and 1938 World Cup winning squads. 1940s. River Plate. English football reigned supreme during the 1940s, even though there was no proper litmus test, but talent within the English game was spread pretty evenly between the clubs, and the sport was rocked by the Second World War. Meanwhile, in Argentina, River Plate were establishing one of the world's first footballing dynasties, and Argentine football wasn't too disrupted by the conflicts. The large number of Italian and German immigrants in Argentina and the country's historic rivalry with Great Britain had led to an alliance with the Axis powers. Argentina did eventually switch over to the Allies side in March 1945, which is a bit like switching teams in the 93rd minute of a football match, so that you end up on the winning side. Anyhow, the River Plate side of the 1940s was a magnificent coming together of some of the finest attacking players in the world. River played with a front 5 that were innovative in their play and in their movement, and the team itself was nicknamed La Máquina, or the Machine. River's front 5 was made up of Juan Carlos Muniz, Jose Manuel Moreno, Adolfo Pedernera, Angel Labruna, and Felix Lestau. Meanwhile, Alfredo Di Stefano also came into the picture towards the end of the decade. River won 10 trophies in total during the 1940s, including 4 league titles and 3 Copa Ibaguren. 1950s. Real Madrid. Real Madrid weren't the best team in the world for the entirety of the 1950s, but from 1953 onwards they were, and that's more than enough to see them take this crown. Real famously won 5 consecutive European Cup trophies between the 1955-56 season and the 1959-60 campaign, which constituted the first 5 editions of the competition. From Jose Santamaria at centre-back to Ferenc Puskás up front, the Real side of the 1950s was packed with quality, but there is a reason why 1953 was the year in which they became the best team in the world, and that reason was called Alfredo Di Stefano. The best player in the world during the 1950s, Di Stefano ran the show even in a star-studded 11, and in addition to their 5 European triumphs, Real also won La Liga 4 times in the decade. 1960s. Santos. It's a battle between Europe and South America once again in the swing 60s, but I don't think you can pick anyone other than Santos. Pelé dominated the 1960s as emphatically as Di Stefano had the 1950s, and like Di Stefano, he also had a number of excellent players around him. Santos dominated the Brazilian game during the 1960s, winning 6 Campeonato Brasileiro titles despite their attention not always being on the domestic game. Thanks to Pelé's star appeal, Santos often found it more profitable going on tours of Europe than competing on home soil, and they played a total of 123 games against European opposition during Pelé's time at the club. Santos and Pele destroyed Benfica and AC Milan in the Intercontinental Cup, who were two of the best teams in Europe during the 1960s, and I don't think there was a better team in world football than them throughout the 1960s. 1970s. Ajax. No team was dominant internationally throughout the 1970s, but both Ajax and Bayern Munich did win a trio of consecutive European Cups. Meanwhile, Liverpool won back-to-back European Cups towards the end of the decade. Both Bayern and Liverpool deserve honourable mentions, as do Borussia Mönchengladbach, but my choice for the 1970s is Ajax. Just as was the case with Real in the 1950s and Santos in the 1960s, the 1970s Ajax side had an era-defining player in the form of Johan Cruyff. Ajax won 5 Eredivisie titles, 3 European Cups, 4 KNVB Cups, 1 UEFA Super Cup, and 1 Intercontinental Cup during the 1970s, whilst playing a beautiful, pioneering brand of football. Ajax became less dominant on the European stage following Cruyff's departure in 1973 for Barcelona, but they're still worthy winners here. 1980s. Liverpool. Having been denied by Ajax in the 1970s, Liverpool weren't to be overlooked in the 1980s. The Reds continued their fine form from the back end of the previous decade to make the 1980s the most successful era in Liverpool history. Under the management of Bill Shankly for the first half and Bob Paisley for the second half of the decade, Liverpool won 6 First Division titles, 2 European Cups, 2 FA Cups, and 4 League Cups. The Merseyside Giants were also losing European Cup finalists once and First Division runners-up thrice, with the squad boasting the likes of Kenny Dalglish, Graham Souness, and Alan Hansen rarely letting their standards drop. 1990s. AC Milan. Serie A was the best league in the world during the 1990s, and only Barcelona's dream team can really rival AC Milan and Juventus for the title of the greatest team of the 1990s. Despite playing in the strongest league in the world, AC Milan won the Scudetto 5 times in the 1990s, in addition to being the only club to win the European Cup/Champions League more than once that decade. Milan began the 90s as an unstoppable force under Arrigo Sacchi, with Dutch trio Frank Rijkaard, Ruud Gullit and Marco van Basten, combined with the likes of Baresi, Maldini and Costa Curta in defence, making them a ruthlessly brilliant machine. Later in the decade, they had slightly less spectacular individuals, but were just as functional under Fabio Capello, and they're the right choice for the 1990s as a whole. 2000s. Manchester United. My sneaking suspicion is that my choices for the 2 most recent decades will be the most hotly debated in the comments, partly because they're the only 2 a lot of people will have lived through, and partly because there are no really obvious candidates for either. My choice for the 2000s is Manchester United, who really stamped down their authority on the English game under Sir Alex Ferguson, but failed to become dominant within the European game. Having won the competition in 1999, the Red Devils reached 2 Champions League finals in the 2000s, beating Chelsea in one, and losing to Barcelona in the other. That does count against them, but the league is the real measure of a team across an entire league campaign, and United faced stern tests from a brilliant Arsenal side and a free-spending Chelsea side in the Premier League during the 2000s. Despite those challenges, Ferguson's side won 6 league titles, in addition to 2 League Cups, 1 FA Cup, and that 1 Champions League. Honourable mentions here go to Barcelona, Real Madrid, and AC Milan again. 2010s. Barcelona. I've no doubt that probably 80 to 90% of people would pick out Real Madrid as having been the strongest club side of the 2010s, given Los Blancos won the Champions League an incredible 4 times. That is a sensational achievement which makes them serious contenders, but I find it impossible to just overlook the fact they only won 2 La Liga titles. As I've said on this channel multiple times and once already on this video, the league is the true test of an entire squad in terms of their talent, mentality and consistency. Whilst Real Madrid have undoubtedly been not just the finest knockout tournament team of the 2010s, but one of the finest of all time, they let Barcelona win a whopping 7 La Liga titles in the last decade, whilst Atletico Madrid won 1 as well. Barcelona only won the Champions League twice in the 2010s, but they did turn 2011 as one of the best club sides ever assembled under Pep Guardiola. The likes of Xavi, Iniesta, and the indomitable Lionel Messi have made Barca a joy to watch during the 2010s, and whilst they ended the decade as a shadow of the side that they began it, they still ended it as champions of Spain, and as unpopular as it may be, they get my vote for the 2010s. Thank you for watching HITC Sevens, I hope you enjoyed today's video, and feel free to watch any of the other videos on this channel if you did. I'd love to know which team you think will be the best during the 2020s in the comments, along with all the abuse for picking Manchester United for the 2000s and Barcelona for the 2010s. You can't please all of the people all the time, that's for sure. But if you enjoyed the video, feel free to hit the like button and subscribe to the best channel on YouTube run by me with the word Sevens in it.